and I work for the Jenkins project. And please don't hesitate to participate via Twitter by using this QR code. It should appear in most of the slides. Unfortunately, we won't have time for the question, but I hope to see you on community.jenkins.io later on, because at the end of the presentation, you'll get a link to discuss my proposal in community Jenkins.io. Let's start with a flashback to my previous job. I spare you the description of the long evolution of our CI/CD system for mobile development and just give you a quick snapshot of where we were when I left. We were using GitLab-ci and we offered a set of specific Docker images. We had a standard image with the latest versions of all the tools, Maven and Gradle, Android SDK, NDK, Flutter, Firebase, linters, dependency checkers, and so on. The image was in the cache of the runners, which are more or less the equivalent to the Jenkins agents, so that the jobs could be started right away. There were also some specific images with various versions of the tools or with specific tools added. We also had an Android device form linked to GitLab-ci so that developers could test their freshly built app on real Android devices directly from their pipeline. So I resigned last April and got a job in the Jenkins project when I got asked, would you like to replicate parts of what you did for mobile app developers with GitLab-ci, but this time with Jenkins? This way, you would learn about Jenkins while maybe helping future Android app developers already using Jenkins. LazyMe asked 2 questions. Does Jenkins work well with Docker? To which I got the honest answer, sort of. And the second question was, may I do everything from scratch, not looking elsewhere? I don't want to know what's working for Android app development with Jenkins. I want to try to build it with my old GitLab habits, even if that fails. To which my manager said, yeah, go for it. He's one of a kind, letting me reinvent a wonky, cherish rickety wheel for the sake of growing knowledge. Please keep in mind that the 3 goals of this exploration were experiment, learn, and share. CDME was pretty confident this would be a cakewalk. After all, I was into mobile CI/CD for more than 8 years. What could go wrong? To be honest, that has been quite right. So last April, I knew nothing about Jenkins. I was a total newbie. I made every mistake a Jenkins newbie can make. So what to start with? An empty Android app for sure, but it's difficult to teach an old monkey a new trick. So what did I do first? I rebuilt headfirst an Android Docker image, trying to fit in all the tools I could think of, like the one I used to work with within GitLab. And at the time, I thought that it would be done in a few days. It's almost touching to see how naive I can be sometimes. And at the same time, I installed Jenkins thanks to Docker on my Windows laptop and tried a few tutorials with the simplest jobs possible that worked. Once I got my bulky, full of tools. Oh, damn it. The moderator is telling me the slides can't be seen. So I guess there is something to do about that. Sorry, audience. Can you please reshare it? Yes, I can do that. Window. Is it any better now? I guess so. Let's hope so. No. Oh. We love IT unless when it doesn't work anymore. So, is there anything I can do? Let me try it once again. You never know. It works, really. Okay. I will never be able to finish the talk. I'm very sorry about that. So, it's all good now. So once I got my big, bulky, full of tools Docker image pushed to Docker Hub, I went on to the creation of the empty Android application, and we would then connect the dots later on. So I created a new repo on GitHub, cloned it on my laptop, opened Android Studio, and created a new application from scratch within that folder. I then committed and pushed the app shell thanks to GitHub and added a GitHub action file so that we could see if the application could be built outside of my machine. The QR code will lead you to the repo because, yes, you can build a simple Android app directly with GitHub Action. GitHub has Java and Android SDK in their Ubuntu latest image. So at this stage, my empty app could be built on Android Studio and with GitHub Actions. I had my APKs available on Android Studio and within GitHub Action. That's pretty nice. So I had a Jenkins controller running on top of Docker and a Jenkins agent also running on top of Docker on my laptop. But I couldn't get it to run my custom Android building Docker image. But I know this can be done. Now I know, but I also know I could have created a specific agent starting from the SSH Docker image and adding the Android SDK. But at the time, I absolutely wanted to keep my old habits, which are using my custom Docker image and generic agents. Waiting for a solution to my issues under Windows, I then created 2 Jenkins agents on Oracle Cloud free-tier machines and installed Java, Docker, and on top of that, a Jenkins agent handled by systemd. On one of them, I also installed the Android SDK so that it could build Android apps. That's what I call my Jenkins Droid. Then I created a simple Android job on Jenkins, referencing my GitHub repo, and launched the build. So once my first few Gradle commands succeeded, I became more confident and added checks, bundle creations, and was left in the end with a long list of build steps in a freestyle project. And at the time, I discovered that if for whatever reason my controller would restart, my current builds would be gone. Pipeline jobs do not face a gone for eternity issue when your controller restarts. So I thought this was the way to go. I started with a small pipeline description. Then it grew with more stages, more tools, static analysis, compilation, of course, release creation, we'll see in a moment, unit testing, up to the moment where I lost everything. Of course, I told you my controller instance was on my Windows machine, running on top of Docker. And one day, as I was trying to make room for Android builds, I accidentally entered a Docker command that removed all the volumes. So I lost my jobs and their definition. It shouldn't have happened, but when you only have 0 byte left on your disk and that Docker desktop is frozen, strange things can happen. So be it. That was a time when I decided to store my Jenkins files in GitHub along the rest of my files. So each branch can then have its own pipeline with different tools, different agents, different Docker images, whatever. That proved convenient later on. And I said convenient and not perfect, because there, with the pros of getting one Jenkins file per branch, comes also the cons of always getting the last commit on any branch to start a job, and the impossibility of building explicitly the branch you chose. Because let's face it, anything can happen during a build or between 2 builds. Machine-serving dependencies can be down or suffering, or link can be momentarily broken, or Docker image layer can go missing. Tons of bad things can happen. What can I do when the build on branch A failed because of a dependency missing and a build on branch B is starting because it's last commit on the project? For me, it was not a good idea to keep a simple pipeline project when using several branches. That's why I switched to multi-branch pipeline project later on. At this point, I had several branches, 1 Jenkins file per branch, and free-tier machines struggling to stay alive because of the heavy load. I then thought, you know what? I have different Jenkins files on different branches because I'm testing different tools, different stages. So why should I keep the very same Docker image on all the branches? Couldn't I use a different Docker image per branch depending on the tools or the versions of the tools I use? At that time, it made sense, because if you only use a generic version of the Android Docker image, it will take time to download during build the different versions of the tool which are not bundled yet in the default image. And what do developers want? Fast pipelines. And how can we implement that? By having a custom Docker image with all the right versions of the tools. Is this image in the Docker cache? No, it's not. So can we get fast pipelines? Of course we can, 5 minutes or so, but it all depends on the specificity of the agent. Is it attached to only one project? If that's the case, then we can hope that even for various versions of the Docker image, the Docker cache would be big enough that the builds would fire up right away. So I had a different Docker file per branch and an image per branch built per GitHub action and pushed on my Docker Hub repo. And at the time, I had a working declarative pipeline per branch, one Docker image per branch too, and in the end, an application binary ready to be deployed. Ready, really. I could find the binaries in the workspace in a matter of seconds, but there is no release, just binaries. There would be some manual steps to get this into a version release we can deliver to the test users, for example. And of course, we could create manually a release within GitHub and then copy-paste the binaries from Jenkins artifact archive to the GitHub release page. We could also do the same for the Google Play Store, but this is not efficient nor error-prone. Does it make sense to have a release on the GitHub repo at the same time as on Google Play? I think it really depends on the app and its audience, but for this talk, let's assume it's okay. So to automate the release, we have to decide what is the version number, how do we update the version number, and what makes a release. There is a Gradle plugin named Semantic Version that has a strict set of rules that will help us. You can use Gradle commands to increment the patch version, the minor version, the major version. You can use classifiers like snapshot, beta, alpha, or any other version classifier that would help you define a version name. There's a Jenkins plugin called Git changelog that will merge all your commit messages so that you can reproduce a readable version of the changes, but that does not create a release. So if you want to stay on the Jenkins side, there is no plugin for this. But of course, there are lots of different ways to do it. You can use the GitHub API to create a release, but you can also use a gh command, which can do all the heavy lifting for us. So back to the drawing board, let's add the command to our Docker image. And once that's done, we have to use the GitHub app authentication in order to get GH to use our credentials. But to get it to work, you have to install the GitHub branch source plugin. And once it's done, you have to create a GitHub application. So at that moment, I was able to query GitHub via GH to see if the release was already existing and create it if it wasn't. And my choice was totally arbitrary. I shall create a release when the version ends with release, a draft release when there is no suffix, and a pre-release when the version ends with alpha or beta. That's good enough for my use case. And GH does a nice job of preparing a release changelog, so I'm relying on it. When we are not building on the main branch, the release is not finalized, so I can still tidy it up afterward. It's nice to be able to create a release as soon as it's needed, even when it's not really needed. It looks like I may have gone a little too far with the automatic release creation, don't you think? Now, what about using that workflow to create a release on the Play Store? The version is already handled by the Semantic plugin. The release notes are more or less ready to go. We only have to find the right plugin to push to the Google Play Store. And we have a Gradle plugin for that, Triplet Play. So once you've got your Google Play Store account, you have to register the app, to import the EULA, to upload paperwork, and then to upload signed app. And as it's not signed yet, let's do it quickly. You can sign the application via the command line thanks to zipline and APK Signer, or thanks to Jar Signer if you're using a bundle instead of an APK. So first things first, let's build an application bundle, then sign it. But you can also do it directly thanks to Gradle. From now on, when you will create the bundle with Gradle, it will be signed, but self-signed, which is not what we are aiming for. We still have to upload the icon, the summary, screenshots, banner, lots of boilerplate thingies. And the next big thing is to create a GCP project. You have to enable the Android Publisher API for that project to link your Google Play developer account to the GCP project to create a service account and a key. We'll have to create an environment variable within Jenkins. And for that, we first have to install the environment injector plugin. And once it's done, we have to give the service account permission to publish apps on our behalf. And we're finally ready to publish our app thanks to Gradle on Jenkins. The Gradle task group publishing tells us we have a publish bundle task that uploads all app bundle, all variants for the application. And as we did not store the generated GKS file in the repo, we have to use a variable to hold the value. So on your machine, it would look like that. And on Jenkins, we will have to create a secret. So the secret will be available under the Android publisher credentials key. The triplet documentation tells us that we can set up a configuration in the build Gradle file like that. So let's try that. And the documentation also says that we have to supply a release notes files. And for our use case, we'll use the internal track and start from the release notes generated via the GH tool to produce a shorter version limited to 500 characters as specified by Google. Whew. Are we done now? We have an Android application that builds, that has static analysis, that is automatically pushed to GitHub and Google Play Store. What's left? With a standard pipeline project, we have seen that Jenkins always builds the latest modification in the repo, the latest branch where somebody committed and pushed something, anything. So how are we supposed to relaunch the build for a branch that got no commit recently? As far as I know, we can't. So to attain this goal, we have to switch to multi-branch pipelines. So now I can decide which branch to build whenever I want or need to, and I can even see my PRs building. When I create a new branch, I automatically get a new build associated with it. I can tweak each Jenkins file for each branch and even use a different Docker image for each branch. And if ever my pipeline fails because of a missing dependency or because of a failure in the Docker image building, I can still relaunch the build once the issue is solved. I can also build the Docker image locally on the agents with the right tag so that my agents pick the right one without delay. At the time, I wondered if having a generic Docker agent was such a good idea for my use case. Most of my branches were using the same tools, even the same version of the tools, the major difference being one more tool or one more environment variable. Shouldn't I use big Docker image with all the tools and variables and make that into a dedicated Android agent and declare a second agent that would be responsible for other Docker needs like specific Docker image? What was the aim of this project after all? Wasn't it just to build a POC to see if an Android app could be easily built with Jenkins, with a bonus, which is that someone else could later on try it on his own without much effort? I wasn't looking for designing the perfect Jenkins Android build farm, so why get a generic Docker agent to do everything? Shouldn't we use something less generic and more pragmatic? I left that thinking for a few weeks. Later on, I lost all my Jenkins controller configuration, but the Jenkins file, which was in the SCM. So why not do it in another way and store it in the SCM too? I then moved to Docker Compose and configuration as code. Because yes, I had previously encountered some problems when running Jenkins in Docker on Windows, but it went way more smoothly with Docker Compose. You can easily share volumes if needed, expose ports, and define precisely what you need in a more explicit way than a bunch of Docker commands with cryptic arguments. You would just need one command to launch the whole Jenkins system, and you will be able to restart just a part of this system with the same command by adding just one explicit argument. And furthermore, it has been tested with Windows, Ubuntu, macOS x86, and ARM, and Vagrant, and it works. You know what's next, don't you? Of course. I went headfirst and exported the whole configuration as the base to work on. That was not the best idea I ever had. So after a while, I started from scratch, and with some help, I got a working JCASC minimal system, and then I made a few iterations until I got something interesting. I was pretty happy with that until I realized jobs were not part of that JCASC import-export. I had to use a poor man's JCASC, which is basically copy and paste files and folders from the running Jenkins controller. It's just a matter of getting the contents of var, Jenkins home, and then take only what you're interested in, the jobs in my case. And once you get the files, you only need to modify the Docker file, but these jobs are now part of the controller image. Okay, I now have a Jenkins system that I can replicate just about anywhere, an app that builds on top of it with the associated jobs and that can be deployed to GitHub and Google Play Store. What's next? It would make sense to release an application that has not been tested I know that in theory we've done quality assurance and we'll do unit testing in a while, so all should go fine, except that we don't live in theory. There are two major kinds of testing: unit testing, for which you don't need a real or emulated device, and instrumented testing, where you need some kind of Android device available. Because let's face it, an app is incomplete until it's tested on devices, real devices, that is, target devices, if they exist for your application. And what do Android app developers do when they want to test? They have their own device connected to their laptop if the project has a tight budget, but also using the default Android emulators, or they're using a remote device farm if they're lucky. So when you install the Android SDK, you can create emulators on the fly, but it's not trivial with Docker, and especially under Windows, because you need nested virtualization and specific kernel modules. The emulator we're using is an official image from Google with a recent version of Android. So to summarize, we have defined in that Docker compose file a controller, an Android agent, a generic Docker agent on the emulator. We can now run these commands. I'm sure you see the obvious limitation with that way of doing things. What will happen when one PR will ask for a build at the same time as a branch building after a commit push? Of course, we can't access the same emulator at the same time, trying to install two different versions of the same application and launching tests on this application. This proposal is flawed by design. Remember, this exploration is a proof of concept, and it's no way something you could copy and paste to production. But I already can see some eyebrows raising, of course. We have some Jenkins experts in there. There's a plugin for that. It's just a matter of declaring a new lockable resource in Manage Jenkins Configure System, Lockable Resource Manager, and you're good to go. The next step is to use a lock with the right name in your Jenkins file, and it just works, and with JCask too. The problem we have is that our proof of concept may test different versions of the application at the same time on the same device. We created a bottleneck with the lockable resource, and you saw it coming. We could add some more emulators, but who would handle the load balancing? A device farm, maybe? STF is a device farm, and its pretty simple feature is to handle a bunch of real Android devices and to lend them to projects wanted to test on devices. And this farm can also work with emulators, so that's definitely something I'll implement soon. And it can also work with your real devices linked to your Windows or Linux machine, thanks to Docker, so that you could test your application on your own device through CI. I can brag. I do brag. Yeah, I got a working job that builds and publishes an Android application thanks to Jenkins on my machine. Will it work on yours? And as I say, sharing is caring, and I do care for mobile app developers and people who want to get involved into CI/CD for mobile applications. So I have to share. And how could you replicate my work at home, at work? I already told you my Docker Compose file worked in the Windows, macOS, Linux, and Vagrant. That's pretty nice, but would it work in the park on your Chromebook? Maybe. What about trying that on your own laptop? Even if I don't really like to mix my Android application with my Jenkins setup, you could get my proposal up and running on any machine of your herd in a few minutes. You just have to fork my repo and enter this Docker Compose command in the Jenkins door. Of course, before entering that command, you should have created a GitHub app, installed it on your fork, have a Google Play developer account, have the right credentials with you, and copy all of that in a .env file in your local copy of the fork is a Jenkins dir. Now, what about getting something beefier than the feature and even easier to set up? Something that would give you enough disk space, RAM, and power to test my proposal. Something that would work at a click of a button. Something as free as it gets. Something that could also work on your Chromebook or your smartphone or your Steam Deck or even your car entertainment system. It's Gitpod. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to finish at all because of technical issues, so you won't get much information about that. But let's finish for today, if you don't mind. So now I need your help. Please, I need to hear your point of view. I want to know what you're doing for Android and Jenkins and how you're doing it and what's missing from your point of view. I'd love it if the community gathers and finds a solution to build mobile app thanks to Jenkins. Now that you know what we could do for Android developers, we could also try to address what iOS developers face when trying to use CI/CD. Getting Android apps to build with Jenkins was kind of challenging for me, but iOS, that's a whole different story. Thanks a lot for the attention. Sorry for the technical issues, and see you on Community Jenkins IO to get your feedback on this solution and some input on yours. Thank you. Goodbye.
Okay, we are done. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, it was a brilliant presentation. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Unfortunately, I wasn't able